Montana Territory, 1882. The wind howled over the wide plains as the stagecoach came to a stop outside the dusty post office in Dry Creek. Georgia Cavanaugh stepped down, her boots hitting the packed dirt road with a weight that matched the knot in her stomach. She clutched the letter in her satchel, the one that had promised her a future, the one that said she'd been accepted as a mail-order bride by a rancher named Elijah Turner, a widower with 2 children and a need for a woman to tend his home. It was not love, not even close. But after her father's death and the debts that swallowed the family farm in Pennsylvania, she had no home left to return to. A thin man with a tobacco-stained hat approached her. "You Georgia Cavanaugh?" She nodded, brushing the dust from her skirt. "Yes, sir. Name's Harold. Elijah sent me to fetch you. He's up at the Turner place, East Ridge." As Harold loaded her trunk, a low voice spoke from behind her. "You sure you want to go up there?" Georgia turned. A tall man leaned against the fence post, arms crossed. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, revealing sun-darkened skin and forearms thick with work. His eyes, a sharp, unsettled blue, stayed on hers longer than most men dared. "Excuse me?" she asked. He stepped closer. "You do not know him. You do not know what you are walking into." "I do not have a choice. I do not think that is true," he said quietly, but it carried louder than the wind. "My name is Boone Valen." She had to tilt her chin to hold his gaze. "Well, Boone Valen, I was promised, and I keep my word." His jaw clenched. "I just think a man ought to be chosen, not paid for." Harold barked out a laugh. "She ain't for you, Boone. Elijah sent for her fair and square. Move on." Georgia turned her face away, hiding the strange twist in her chest. She had been warned about men like Boone, rough, unpredictable, too proud for their own good. But something in his voice had not felt like pride. It had felt like something else. The ride up to the Turner Ranch was quiet. Georgia kept her hands clenched tight in her lap. The land stretched endlessly, rimmed with pine. When they arrived, the house looked worn but large, set against the slope of a hill. 2 children stood on the porch, a boy of maybe 8 and a girl near 6. Both barefoot, both with wary eyes. A man stepped out behind them. Elijah Turner, thinner than she expected. His eyes were dull behind a coarse beard, his shirt stained with what looked like last night's stew. "You're the girl," he muttered, taking her measure like one might a mule. "Well, come on then. Kids, this is your new ma." The boy narrowed his eyes. "Our ma is dead." "Enough, Wilhelm," Elijah snapped. Georgia bent down, forcing a small smile. "Hello, Wilhelm. And you must be Willa." The girl clung to her brother's sleeve, silent. That night, the house felt colder than it should have. Elijah did not speak much. He ate, drank, and disappeared to the barn. Georgia tucked the children into their shared bed, brushing Wilhelm's hair back gently. "Do you want me here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He stared at the ceiling. "Do not matter what I want." Georgia did not sleep much that night. The next morning, Boone showed up at the ranch gate on horseback. "I came to bring some fence wire Elijah ordered 2 weeks ago," he called out. Georgia stepped onto the porch. "He is in the barn." Boone dismounted, eyes flicking to her. "Are you all right?" "I am managing," she said, lifting her chin. "You do not have to stay. I do not have anywhere else to go." Boone watched her for a long moment. "That is not the same thing." Later that same day, she saw Elijah strike Wilhelm across the back of the head for dropping a pot. The sound made her blood turn. She stepped between them without thinking. "Do not touch that boy again," she said, voice shaking. Elijah's eyes narrowed. "You think you get a say just because you wear a skirt and wash the dishes?" Georgia's hands trembled, but she did not move. That night, she packed a bag. She waited until the house was still, then went to the children's room. "I am leaving," she whispered. "You can come with me, but we have to go now." Wilhelm sat up instantly. "You are taking us?" "Yes. I will not leave you here." They slipped out into the dark, the boy holding his sister's hand. Georgia had no plan but one name in her mind: Boone. They reached Dry Creek before sunrise. Boone's cabin sat just beyond the edge of town, near the tree line. She knocked. He opened the door in his trousers and undershirt, eyes widening at the sight of her and the children. "I need help," she said. He stepped back without a word, letting them in. Inside, the cabin was clean and warm, a fire already burning. Wilhelm sat down near it, arms around his sister. Georgia stood uncertain in the doorway. "I could not leave them," she said, voice cracking. Boone reached for her bag and set it down. "You did right. Elijah will come." "Let him," Boone said. She looked up at him, at the solid line of his jaw, the quiet steadiness in his face. "Why are you doing this?" He did not look away. "Because I would rather be chosen than paid for." Georgia's breath caught in her throat. "I did not choose Elijah," she said, her voice low. "I did not know I could choose." Boone's hand brushed hers just barely. "But enough. You can," he said. And for the first time since her father died, Georgia Cavanaugh felt safe. The first light of morning filtered through the pine outside Boone's cabin, slanting golden across the floorboards. Georgia stood at the stove, sleeves rolled, stirring cornmeal into a pot. Her hands moved without thought, but her breath caught every time the wind shifted outside. She hadn't heard a horse, not yet, but she expected one. Boone came in from the yard, wiping his hands on his trousers. His coat hung open, hair still damp from the cold pump. He glanced at the children, huddled on a quilt near the hearth, then at Georgia. "You sleep any?" he asked. "A little," she said. Willa kicked once or twice. Wilhelm didn't move at all. He pulled a chair from the table. "He's watching, for whatever comes." Georgia set the pot on the table. "Do you believe Elijah will come here?" Boone's jaw moved once. "He'll wait until he thinks I'm alone. Then he'll try to talk mean, maybe worse. But he won't come with a badge. He's no right to them, and he knows it." She sat across from him, wrapping her fingers around a mug. "If he tries to take them, he won't," Boone said, voice steady. "Not while I've got a pulse." Georgia looked at Willa, who was tracing a finger along the seam in her brother's shirt. Boone's words were a promise, not a comfort. "Where did you learn to care like that?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "My mother ran off when I was small. My father wasn't cruel, just careless. Drank too much, forgot birthdays. I spent more time with our neighbors' goats than with people. But I remember the way it felt being overlooked. Felt like I was made of smoke. I reckon nobody should feel that." Georgia nodded once, the weight of it settling between them. Boone stood and opened the cupboard above the stove. "You'll need warmer things if you're staying. There's a shawl in here. Wasn't mine." She took it gently when he offered it. The wool smelled faintly of cedar. "Whose was it?" "Woman I was due to marry. She died before it came to it." Georgia wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, eyes lowered. "I'm sorry." He shrugged once. "It was a long time ago." She had a soft laugh, though. "I remember that more than anything." Outside, the wind shifted again. Boone stepped to the window, gaze drawn to the hill. "You still have her things," Georgia said softly. "I don't hold on to much," he replied. "But I hold on to kindness when I find it." Hours passed in quiet tasks. Georgia unpacked what little she'd brought, mostly thread, a few books, and her mother's sewing shears. Boone set about repairing a loose shutter, Wilhelm trailing behind him, asking questions about nails and wood grain. Willa stayed near Georgia, content to sort dried beans into neat piles on the table. When the sun reached its peak, a knock startled them all. Boone opened the door without hesitation. A short man stood there, bundled in a heavy coat, hat drawn low. He didn't look like Elijah. "Boone," the man said. "You got a minute?" Boone stepped out, closing the door behind him. Georgia pressed her palm to her chest, steadying her breath. Willa looked up at her. From beyond the door, voices passed low and tight, a few words clear enough to catch. "Saw him in town. Asking questions. Sheriff won't interfere." When Boone returned, his face had hardened. "Elijah's been through Dry Creek," he said. "Said you stole his wife and his children." "I never said the vows," Georgia replied, voice trembling. "And they aren't his blood." He nodded. "Doesn't matter to the kind of men who want to believe him." "Then what do we do?" Boone's eyes never left hers. "We make it known you're under my roof because you chose to be." Georgia's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying if you say the word, I'll walk with you to the preacher's house. Today." She didn't answer right away. She looked at Wilhelm, who was watching them both with a sharp, unreadable expression. Then at Willa, who had begun humming under her breath, rocking slightly where she sat. Georgia rose. "I never wanted to marry for safety." "You won't be," Boone said. "You'll be marrying because I'd rather be chosen than paid for. And because I think maybe you'd rather choose too." She crossed the room slowly, until only a breath stood between them. "I never got the chance to choose anything before. You do now." She looked down at her hands, then laid one gently over his heart. "Then I choose you," she said. His arms came around her with quiet conviction, not urgency. A shelter, not a claim. Outside, the wind had stilled. The preacher's cabin sat where the cottonwoods thinned out above Dry Creek, tucked behind the chapel and half sunk into the slope like it had grown there. Boone knocked once and waited with his hat in hand. Georgia stood beside him, her coat buttoned clear to her throat, the shawl tucked beneath. Wilhelm held Willa's hand a few paces back, watching Georgia's face instead of the door. The preacher, a stoop-shouldered man with a faded collar and a voice like gravel, opened the door and blinked at them. "Boone Valen," he said. "Didn't expect you." "Need a word," Boone said. "Private." The preacher stepped aside without asking further. Georgia followed Boone in, her hands clasped tightly before her. The room smelled of ink and wood smoke. A Bible rested open on the desk beside a stack of correspondence. "We're asking you to marry us," Boone said, steady as the floor beneath their boots. The preacher looked between them, his brow furrowing. "You come with a license?" Boone nodded. "Filed it yesterday." Doc Harris signed the witness line. The preacher scratched at his chin. "You both certain? It don't seem long." "I've waited long enough," Georgia said, her voice quiet but shaped like stone. The preacher studied her, then Boone. "Well, I've married folks with less reason and worse manners. Wait here." He returned with the book, the one with the vows and the place to sign. The ceremony lasted no more than 5 minutes. Boone's voice was low but sure when he spoke. Georgia's cracked once, but she didn't falter. When it was done, Boone signed his name, then handed her the pen. She wrote carefully, Georgia Cavanaugh no longer. Outside, Wilhelm stared at the snowmelt trickling in the ditch. Willa had grown tired and leaned against a tree with her thumb in her mouth. Boone knelt beside the boy. "You all right?" Wilhelm shrugged. "I guess. Your say counts," Boone said. "Even if you're young." Wilhelm glanced at Georgia, then back. "You gonna keep us?" "For as long as you want keeping." The boy didn't answer, but he nodded once and that was enough. Back at the cabin, Georgia set the kettle on while Boone chopped kindling beside the door. She moved without hesitation now, folding herself into the space like she'd always belonged. The children shared a quiet game in the corner with a set of carved animals Boone had whittled long ago and nearly forgotten. Later, Boone brought in a bundle of cut pine and set it beside the hearth. Georgia looked up from the mending in her lap. "I'd like to earn my place here," she said. "You already have. I want to be useful." He leaned his shoulder against the wall. "You think raising 2 children in a strange place with no one but a stubborn fool for company ain't useful?" She smiled, then caught herself. "There's more I can do." "All right," he said. "There's a spring up behind the ridge that needs clearing. Some of the water's been pooling too low. Once it warms, we'll ride up." Georgia nodded. "Also, you sew better than I do." The girl's dress hems unraveling. She bent to examine it. "I can fix that." He watched her a moment longer. "I don't expect you to be anything but yourself. I don't know who that is yet." Boone crossed the room and sat beside her. "Then I reckon we'll figure it out together." That night, the cabin settled quiet around them. Boone took to the cot near the window, leaving the bed to Georgia and Willa. Wilhelm curled beneath a quilt on the floor, not far from the stove. The wind had stilled again, but this time it didn't feel like waiting. Felt like breathing. In the dark, Georgia whispered, "Boone!" His voice came back low. "Yeah. I used to think I was something someone could bargain for. You're not. I know that now." He didn't say anything more, but his silence held her steady. In the morning, they would start the work of spring. There were fences to mend, bread to bake, water to fetch, and a life to build. But for the first time in years, Georgia wasn't afraid of the days ahead. She had chosen and been chosen in return. And after everything she'd endured, that felt like a kind of miracle. The thaw came slow that year. Snow still clung to the shaded hollows, and ice held stubborn along the creek. But the sun had warmed enough earth for seedlings to take root. Boone showed Georgia how to read the land's lean where water would pool after a hard rain, where the soil was too shallow for anything but scrub. She watched his hands more than his words, learning not just what he did, but how he moved through the world with quiet certainty. One evening, Boone came in with a strip of torn leather and a small tin of beeswax. He set them on the table beside her sewing. "Wilhelm needs a new strap for his boot. I figured you'd do better with it than I would." Georgia turned the leather over in her hands. "You could have fixed it. Maybe. But I wanted him to see you do it. He trusts you more with things that hold." She met his eyes. "You think he sees me that way?" "He doesn't sleep with both eyes open anymore." Georgia stitched the strap without another word, but her hands moved steadier than they had before. Wilhelm had taken to following Boone at a distance when he worked the fence line, not asking questions this time, just watching. Boone never called him out for it. Instead, he started leaving the gate unlatched and the hammer resting on the fence post nearest the edge of the yard, where a boy might feel welcome without being told so. Willa, in turn, began to hum when she fed the chickens. Georgia noticed it first soft, tuneless at first, then shaping into the hymn Georgia had sung once while washing linens. She didn't point it out. She just kept singing when the moment wanted it and let the girl pick up the tune in her own time. That Sunday, Boone hitched the wagon and set a blanket across the bench seat. Georgia came out with her hair braided in a crown across her head, coat buttoned and gloves mended from an old pair of his. The children climbed in without being told. As they crested the ridge above the creek, Georgia glanced over. "You don't seem the type to sit through a sermon." "Wasn't about the sermon," Boone said. "I figured folks ought to see us come in together." She turned her face toward the wind. "You think Elijah's still trying to stir something?" "He hasn't shown, not since that day in Dry Creek. But a man like that don't vanish. He waits." Inside the chapel, heads turned. A few women offered nods. One old rancher tipped his hat. Georgia held Willa's hand and kept her chin level. Boone sat beside her, broad shoulders and steady silence. Not one word passed between them during the service, but when the hymn rose, his voice joined hers on the low harmony, and she felt it like a hand in the small of her back, quiet, grounding, sure. Afterward, as the congregation spilled out into the cold sunlight, a woman with a faded bonnet and apron stiff from starch approached Georgia. "You're Boone Valen's wife, then?" she asked. "I am." The woman gave a short nod. "He brought my boy home once. Found him lost out past the bluffs. Didn't say a word about it. Just handed him over with his coat around his shoulders and left." Georgia only said, "That sounds like him." The woman nodded again. "You done well." That evening, Boone sat outside whittling a new handle for the spade. Georgia brought him a mug of broth, the last of the carrots boiled soft with a bone from the smokehouse. "You always fix things that don't ask for fixing?" she asked. He set the blade aside. "Only the ones that matter." She sat beside him on the porch step. "You ever wonder if this life'll hold?" Boone didn't answer right away. He took a long breath, eyes on the line where the trees met the sky. "I don't think about holding," he said. "I think about tending. Every day. The fence, the fire, the folks under this roof. You tend something long enough, it holds." Georgia leaned her shoulder against his. "I'd like to learn that." He reached over and took her hand, not sudden, not grand, just sure. "You already are." Inside, the children's laughter drifted through the open window. They were playing some invented game with buttons and a scrap of muslin. Georgia closed her eyes and listened. The wind moved through the trees like it had been waiting all along for them to be still enough to hear it. And she knew, without needing to be told, that she had chosen right. By late April, green had crept into the corners of the yard, the kind that lingered low and soft, coaxed out by warm rains and longer light. Boone had begun turning the soil behind the cabin, and Georgia worked beside him, her apron heavy with seed packets and her palms dark with loam. Wilhelm dug without being asked, his tongue between his teeth in quiet effort. Willa sat on a flat stone nearby, sorting dried petals into neat circles. Georgia brushed a curl from her forehead. "You always plant this late?" Boone shook his head. "Usually earlier, but the ground wasn't ready. Took longer to soften this year." "I know the feeling," she said, and her voice held something gentler than jest. He glanced up, his eyes catching hers just long enough to make her heartbeat shift. "You've softened just fine." That night, a letter arrived. The post rider passed it off to Boone outside the general store, sweat darkening his collar. Boone read it once, then again, his grip tightening slightly at the corners before folding it and tucking it inside his coat. When he returned home, Georgia was mending a tear in the curtain that faced the back ridge. She looked up when the door opened. "It's from the sheriff in Billings," Boone said, setting the letter on the table. "Elijah's been found." Georgia set her needle down. "Alive! Alive! Arrested for beating a man over a card game. They don't expect he'll be released soon." She pressed her hands flat over her knees. "That's the end of it, then?" Boone sat beside her. "It is, if you want it to be." She looked toward the window, where the children's shadows passed by, chasing each other in the last of the light. "I want peace. For them. For me. For us." He reached out, covered her hand with his. "Then you have it." The next few days were quiet in the way that meant all was well. Georgia began teaching Wilhelm his letters, using a slate Boone had carved from a broken roof tile. Willa took to sitting on Boone's shoulders while he carried her to the creek, claiming she had to see if the birds were talking. One evening, Georgia found Boone on the porch, oiling the rifle he kept behind the door. Not because he feared trouble, but because quiet hands needed something to do. You ever think about the years ahead? She asked, settling beside him. He glanced at her, then back to the barrel. I think about building a smokehouse big enough to last 2 winters. About planting apple trees come fall. About Wilhelm growing tall enough to notice he's stronger than he thinks. About Willa asking questions I can't answer. She smiled. That's not what I meant. He looked at her then, full on. I think about you, still here, hair going silver, laugh lines around your eyes, hands that stay busy even when they don't need to be. She leaned into him, her shoulder resting against his arm. You think I'll laugh that much? I hope so. In early May, they rode out to the ridge together, just the 2 of them. The children stayed with the preacher's wife, who had taken a quiet liking to Willa's humming and Wilhelm's careful manner. Boone led the way up the slope, reins loose in his hand. At the top, they dismounted and stood side by side, the wind lifting her skirt and the smell of pine thick in the air. It's good land, Boone said. Flat enough to build, close enough to water. She turned her face toward him. You want to build here? If we're going to raise those 2 proper, they'll need more room. A loft of their own. A kitchen with space to breathe. She stepped closer, wrapped her arm around his waist. You already decided. I wanted you to see it first. She looked out again at the wide stretch of valley, the creek threading silver below. It'll do. They broke ground that summer. Boone dug the foundation with Wilhelm hauling stones and Georgia driving stakes. Willa carried messages between them, solemn as a judge. They worked until dusk most days, then sat around the fire with bread and beans, sometimes bacon when Boone had luck hunting. By the time the first frost came, the cabin stood firm, roof shingled with split pine, windows framed tight. Inside, the hearth crackled, and the smell of dried thyme hung from the rafters. On the first night they slept there, Boone pulled Georgia close beneath the quilts. She curled into him, her hair loose across his chest. You still think about the years ahead? She asked. He kissed her forehead, slow and certain. Only every day. She pressed her hand to his chest, where his heart beat steady. Then let's make them count. And they did. Over the years, the land held steady beneath them. The children grew tall and sure-footed. Wilhelm took to carpentry, his hands as precise as Boone's. Willa learned to read the sky for weather, taught by George's patient voice and Boone's quiet nods. They raised hens, goats, and 2 litters of pups. They planted apple trees just beyond the ridge, and by the 5th year they bore fruit. Georgia taught letters to the neighbors' children in the afternoons, and Boone built benches for the chapel. Their hands stayed busy, their home full of warmth and sound. They never spoke again of Elijah Turner. Some things faded with time like the last frost in spring. On warm evenings, Boone would sit with Georgia on the porch, her head on his shoulder, and watch the dusk settle over the land they'd made their own. He'd rest his hand over hers, thumb brushing the worn line where her wedding band sat. And in those quiet moments, with the smell of wood smoke and the sound of laughter drifting from inside, they knew what they'd built would last. Not because it had come easy, but because it had been chosen, tended, mended, and made strong by love earned the hard way. They lived out their days content, side by side, hearts steady as the land beneath their feet.